I'm with Jon Stock. Jon writes under his own name and also as J.S. Munro. He has a new book out, The Other You. That's following on from Forget My Name, which was based locally around Swindon and Wiltshire. Very famous for the Dead Spy Running series trilogy, which are three fantastic books, Jon, which I've very much enjoyed. So just give us a resume of what you've done and what your plans are for the future.
Well, as you said, at the moment I'm writing under the name J.S. Munro, which is really a sort of a branding issue because I started out life writing under my own name, Jon Stock, and I tended to write spy thrillers. I wrote my first book back in 1997, The Riot Act, which was launched on the top of Canary Wharf Tower, which is a strange thought now because it was deserted in those days. The top 25 floors were empty, and the telegraph where I was working was in the was in the 12th floor, I think. And I asked the management of the tower, could we have a party for a book launch at the top of the tower? And they said, yeah. So we did, which was great. So I wrote that, and I wrote another one about 4 years later after being a correspondent in India, a foreign correspondent. And that was set in India, the Cardamom Club. And then we had a young family, and I was working at the Telegraph for a long while as an editor of the weekend section. And I thought I'd give myself one more roll of the dice. So I set about trying to write a spy thriller that would be unashamedly cinematic. So, because I knew as a writer, you can earn money through books a bit, but if you really want to sort of make some serious money to support a family full time, then you need to have a sort of film option. So on the Bedouin to London Paddington train, I wrote Dead Spy Running, which was a spy thriller. And I think what's interesting for people who are interested in writing themselves, I wrote 25,000 words and then tried to find an agent because I'd stopped being represented by an agent at that point. I sent the 25,000 words to one agent who wrote back saying, I don't love this book enough to be able to go out there and sell it. And my daughter, who was about, I think, 6 at the time, wandered around the house saying, they don't love Daddy's book enough. And I said, don't worry, it's very subjective, this writing business. And sure enough, a few days later, I got a message back, having sent the same 25,000 words to another agent who said, I'm loving every word, please send me the rest of it. And when I did, and she got me a 3-book deal with HarperCollins, and Warner Brothers then bought the film rights. So that was an example where that first agent and several other publishers and agents as well both said they didn't like it, and someone else said, I love it. And that's the kind of nature of book writing, really. You just have to sort of have that self-belief. So I wrote 3 books in the end. I only meant to write 1, but my agent did this 3-book deal. I had to write a very detailed synopsis of book 2, having not had a thought about book 2, and indeed a little synopsis for book 3. And at that stage, I'd only written 1 book. So I kind of bluffed a synopsis for the next 2, wrote them, and of course they bore no resemblance to the synopsis, but no one seemed to mind or notice. And those 3 books came out. Warner Brothers developed the film for 7 years. They had about 5 different directors attached, 4 different screenwriters. And eventually the option lapsed, and someone called McGee bought the option. He directed Terminator 4. And that was the last I heard of it, really. I hope something might happen with it one day, but you can't stake too much hopes on the film world. They paid me some nice option money, but so many films get developed and then don't get made. So I then decided to rebrand myself again and wrote some psychological thrillers because that has a broader appeal. To be honest with you, it has a wider commercial appeal as well. It's a much bigger genre. And so I started writing psychological thrillers under the name J.S. Munro. And the first one of these was Find Me, which has been translated into 14 languages now. And in fact, last week, the Italian edition came out, and it seems to be going down well there. The Spanish and the Italian seem to like it. Didn't do very well in Germany or France, but for some reason, the Spanish and the Italian seem to have really gone for it. They like their thrillers dark, which is what I write under J.S. Munro, I think. So I've written 3 of those now, as you said, Find Me, Forget My Name, and the new one, The Other You. And I'm currently writing the 4th one. The last 3 of those all feature D.I. Silas Hart, the detective from Swindon CID. And he, I think, will be a recurring character in the books. So I'm having a meeting with my editor soon to discuss which way the whole market is going for psychological thrillers. Are we getting this hybrid police procedural and psychological thriller? Is that going to hang around? Are we going back to domestic noir? We're sort of really looking at seeing what the market's doing and seeing what areas I'm interested in writing. And I seem to have arrived at, with a new book I'm writing, a kind of hybrid between police procedural, psychological thriller and espionage. But whether the espionage can be believed or not, or if it's a misdirection, we'll have to wait and see.
Excellent. And of course, the changing dynamic in the world. So you're your Dead Spy Running were kind of Middle Eastern based in terms of the characters. It's really interesting, isn't it, how the world is changing in terms of relationships. Obviously, Trump as president of the US at the moment, and maybe or maybe not, he'll get a second term, and his relationships with Putin and North Korea and China. Does that give you food for thought in terms of future ideas for espionage books?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, you're right, absolutely right. I was writing the Daniel Marchant trilogy, starting with Dead Spy Running, in the kind of post 9/11 world when all eyes were focused on Al Qaeda, and the world has indeed changed. You know, even with ISIS, it's sort of the axis has moved somewhat away from where the original centers where Al Qaeda was operating from. I think that the kind of it's fertile times for a good old fashioned Cold War thriller, but in the modern era. I mean, the way Putin is behaving at the moment, I think you've got great scope. If I wrote another Daniel Marchant, I'll be straight back in there with, I think, more Europe against Russia rather than America. Because at the moment, as you say, Trump in power, it's slightly complicated, the relationship between Trump and Putin. I mean, that would be a backdrop to it, but I would want to look at the relationship certainly between Europe and Putin, and in particular the UK. And as you say, North Korea and China are big players on the international chessboard. But I think the spy genre lends itself best, because it blossomed under Le Carré and Len Deighton and things, in that Russia, Europe environment. And I think we're seeing a return to that. So yes, I think that's where I would go now, rather than looking at ISIS and Al Qaeda and all their modern incarnations.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know whether this is a too simplistic a question, but where do you get your ideas from?
Well, I listen to the radio a lot. I do a lot of research online. I read newspapers. What I try and do, I think I come up with an idea about an initial kind of idea. So in Forget My Name, it was a woman turning up in a village and she doesn't know who she is. She's lost her memory, all ID. Who is this person? So I drop her in the middle of that, and then I kind of expand out from that and then do my research to sort of flesh out that idea. Similarly with The Other You, this idea of a woman coming down to a man coming down to her girlfriend in Cornwall, and she's convinced that it's not her boyfriend. That's an initial idea. So I like to sort of dig myself this hole at the beginning and then see how I can get out of it. So who knows where those ideas come from? I think the other thing to stress for aspiring writers is that, you can't just sit around and wait for ideas to come. My ideas come when I sit at my desk day after day and work away at it. And it's this old adage of it's 95% perspiration and 5% inspiration. The ideas come when you start to get disciplined about being a writer, and you start really, I literally just sit here and think and think and think. I'm not sort of wandering around the garden doing something else. I'm at my desk, and it might not look like I'm working, but I'm trying to get myself in a frame of mind where, and it's a funny thing, I just noticed it the other day when I suddenly reached it with this new book, where it's like the synaptic connections in the brain start happening. It starts, my brain starts to make links and connections, but it's only once I get into a certain mindset. And that mindset is not arrived at by wafting around saying, I'm an artist, I'll have inspiration whenever it strikes. You have to go chasing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one final point just to discuss, Johnny, if you don't mind. In terms of consumption, we live now in this world of, actually I was going to say Twitter was 44 characters, but it's expanded, hasn't it? So it's slightly longer. But we want everything bite-sized, we want everything summarised for us, we want the highlights. Has that affected your writing style? I did notice with one of your books that you've got quite short chapters, and it was structured around each chapter had a lead character, and so once that element of the story was finished, the chapter changed. I enjoyed that. I found that very easy to consume. Is that something that you're thinking about because of the changes in the way we consume, or was that just the particular structure of that book? Yeah,
it's a really interesting point. The Find Me had 3 points of view, so telling the story from 3 different points of view. One of them was in the first person, 2 were in the third person. I gave no signposting at all. It also moved around in time, so you didn't know. I did signpost the time differences when there were flashbacks, but it was quite a complicated narrative structure, which I was fine with, otherwise I wouldn't have written it, but we discussed it at my publishers, and so certainly in Forget My Name, it was a bit more clearly signposted. And in The Other You, I do put the name of the character at the beginning of each chapter, so you know where that point of view is coming from. So you're holding the reader's hand a bit. It's a long book, The Other You. And so I felt even more, a lot of people said, oh, it's a bit long compared to most thrillers now. It's actually not that much longer. But I felt even more the need to break it up into smaller chapters. And generally people really like that. And I always have in mind this reader who's reading at 2:00 in the morning thinking one more chapter. And they get to the end of each chapter and I make sure there's something at the end of that chapter. So they turn the page and read another chapter. So yes, I think you have to acknowledge that there is a generation growing up with a not a smaller attention span. It's just that the kind of the way we're being treated on telly now, with the fast editing that goes on a lot of things. I have responded to that in the nature of chopping and changing points of view and having shorter chapters, but that doesn't stop you from addressing some pretty meaty themes, I hope, and some very serious subjects, but just accepting that people want a slightly more palatable approach in the way you structure a book.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for your time, John. Your book, The Other You, is available now, isn't it, in hardback, online, etc. And we'd like to speak with you again, if we may, when that comes out in paperback.
Indeed, of course. Yeah.